Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing very well. Today we're looking at the history and the importance of QNH and QFE. Now I've been putting this off for about a year now because, who wants to do a video about altimeter pressure settings? It can't be that exciting, right? Instead, let's go and do a video on shooting down helicopters with AIM-54s. That's been my thinking. But the reality is, it's actually a very interesting piece of history and something you should know. And I guess that's another question. In DCS, we're not real pilots in DCS, it's just a simulation. How important is QNH? How important is QFE? Do we really need to understand it for DCS? And we are mainly, a DCS channel. The answer is yes. So we are going to have to go and learn it. So please sit tight and let's go and have a closer look at it. First of all, thank you to Soames for putting most of this stuff together for me just to get me going. So QNH and QFE are part of a series of aeronautical code signals which are in turn part of a larger set of Q codes. Q codes were originally created around the beginning of the 20th century for British maritime radio, for the Q code C there. So we're going to jump to Wikipedia to look at the beginning of the history. We're going to split this into two, like we do with most videos. We're going to look at the history and the theory and the background, and then we're going to jump into DCS and we're going to see why all this stuff is important, why we have to know this stuff. And interspersed, we're going to show why this is useful, in the real world as a real pilot. So QNH and QFE have always been a bit of a mystery to me. It's taken a good long time for me to actually really understand what they're about and why they are a thing. Now, the good thing is they are really simple once you get your head around it. Really useful and really simple. And as for their weird name, why have they got such a weird name? QFE, QNH. Sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? And it's because they started off life in the early 20th century as part of the Q code series. So we'll read through this a little bit. The Q code is a standardized collection of 3-letter codes, all of which started with the letter Q. It is an operated signal initially developed for commercial radio telegraph communication and later adopted by other radio services, especially amateur radio. To distinguish the use of a Q code transmitted as a question from the same Q code transmitted as a statement, operators either prefixed it with the military network question marker, which is INT, dit dit da dit da. And remember, this is all about Morse code. This is where Morse code is the main way of transmitting, and that's why we've got these abbreviations, these 3-letter abbreviations, so you didn't have to write out a whole sentence in dits and das. Or suffixed with the standard Morse question mark UD, dit dit da da dit dit. Although Q codes were created when radio used Morse code exclusively, they continued to be employed after the introduction of voice transmissions. To avoid confusion, transmitter call signs are restricted. No country is ever issued with an ITU prefix starting with a Q. Q, the letter at the beginning, has no official meaning. It's sometimes assigned with a word with mnemonic value, such as Queens, e.g. QFE, Queens, airfield elevation, query, question, or request. The cool thing about this is 110 years later in aviation, we're still using QNH and QFE as it was used 110 years earlier. I think that's cool. So, early developments. We'll quickly blast through this because it's interesting. The original Q codes were created circa 1909 by the British government as a list of abbreviations prepared for the use for British ships and coast stations licensed by the Postmaster General. The Q codes facilitated communication between maritime radio operators speaking different languages, so they were soon adopted internationally. A total of 45 Q codes appeared in the list of abbreviations to be used in radio communications, which included the service regulations affixed to the Third International Radio Telegraph Convention in London. The following table reviews a sample of all Q codes adopted in the 1912 convention. So that's how we started off, okay? And let's just have a couple of interesting things. QRC, what is your true bearing? QRH, what is your wavelength in meters? And so on. Later usage, so we won't read through this, but this is the expansion and how it expanded through the different services. The important thing I want to pick up at this point, we've got hundreds of different Q codes as it expanded, but we've got them broken down into areas. QAA to QNZ were assigned for the International Civil Aviation Organization. That's what we are. We are aviation. And out of interest, we had this range here was for the American Radio Relay League. This range here was for the Maritime Mobile Service, and this here, QRA to QUZ, signed by the International Telecommunications Union Radio Communication Sector, ITU-R. So the ones we're interested in are the aeronautical codes, and don't worry, we're not going to go through them all, but just to give you an idea how many there are, thousands of them. Look at all that. Unbelievable. And so let's just pick on a couple purely for fun. This isn't really relevant today, but QAH, what is your height above brackets datum? And you've got the standardized answer that you've got here. QBF, are you flying in cloud? I'm flying in cloud at level, and we've got a standard set answer. So, yeah, very interesting stuff. Now, let's go to look at the ones which have continued through today. So we've got QNH and QFE. So we're going to hit QFE first of all. So, right, here's our first one, QFE. And the original intended question is, what should I set on the subscale of my altimeter so that the instrument would indicate its height above the reference elevation being used? So if you're reading that for the first time, that's a bunch of gobbledygook, and we need to pick it apart and start understanding the different parts of the sentence. Keywords, altimeter. Well, as we'll see in DCS later, there are two different types of altimeter. Radio altimeter, barometric altimeter. This is relevant only to barometric altimeter. As we'll again look at later, barometric altimeter, even in a modern aircraft like a Hornet, an F-16, a F-15, a flanker, is not actually really a measurer of altitude in any way. It doesn't actually measure feet, it doesn't measure meters. It's actually a pressure gauge. And this took me a while to get my head around. Next word is subscale. How do I set on the subscale of my altimeter? And what this is telling us is that we have a way of adjusting our altimeter, which remember is just a pressure gauge. And that is we can re-zero it, is a way I like to think about it. So all barometric altimeters, however modern they are, will one way or another have a knob or an ability to tune where they have their 0 point set to. And that's key to what we're looking at today in QNH and QFE. So that the instrument, the altimeter, would indicate its height above the reference elevation being used. The next important phrase there is reference elevation. Reference elevation is, I like to say, just, an elevation of interest. And that elevation of interest could be a runway if we're landing. It could be a building if we were bombing it, if we were using it for targeting. It's an elevation of interest. So let's pick that together. How do I set my subscale? So how do I tune my barometric altimeter so that it would indicate its height above the elevation of interest? So that's converted that question into something that I understand a little bit better. Another way that I like to think of this even better is how do I zero my altimeter to our elevation of interest? If we're going to be using this to land at a runway in bad visual conditions, IFR conditions, how do I zero my altimeter to that runway? And the answer is if you set the subscale of your altimeter to read so many millibars, the instrument would indicate its height above the aerodrome. So they've just picked aerodrome in this case, but it's our elevation of interest, whatever that is. And a key thing I want to pick out here is millibars. Again, a barometric altimeter in an aircraft is just a pressure gauge. That's all it is. Now, pressure is measured in different units depending where you are in the world. Annoyingly, there's not much uniformity. If I jump over to this guy here, we may or may not use later. You can see what we'll be looking at today in various aircraft is it could be measured in INHG, inches mercury, or metric, millimeters mercury, or this one, I still don't fully understand it, HPA, some form of pascals, again another measurement unit of measurement of pressure. I don't think I'm going to use this one in DCS. Back to our Q code, so that is the definition of QFE. And we're going to look at what that actually means for flying in DCS in a bit. Next, we're going to scroll down to QNH. QNH. Okay, so we'll read it and then we'll actually understand it. What should I set on the subscale of my altimeter so that the instrument would indicate its elevation if my aircraft were on the ground at your station? Now, reading that's really hard to understand. That's really deceptive, almost kind of wrong in a way, at least to our contemporary understanding of what QNH is. And to kind of prove that, why don't we go and look at a more contemporary, if we just, the quickest way we can possibly to what is QNH. Let's pick the first sentence here. QNH is an aeronautical Q code, ignore that, indicating the atmospheric pressure adjusted to mean sea level. That's what it is. It's the atmospheric pressure at sea level. So we've simplified it a bit there, but we are going to be simplifying things here because we're looking at DCS. DCS is less complicated than this stuff in the real world. That's something to understand. A lot of you are going to say at the end of this, oh, you've missed this out, you've missed that out. A lot of it simply isn't relevant in DCS world. So bearing that in mind, that contemporary understanding of QNH, let's just report back to our Q codes here. What should I set the subscale of my altimeter so the instrument would indicate its elevation if my aircraft were on the ground at your station? So what that's actually saying is if my aircraft were parked on your runway, what should my altimeter read above sea level? Or another way of understanding that is, how do we use the tuning knob, on my pressure gauge, so that my pressure gauge reads 0 feet or 0 meters at sea level. That is QNH, and that ties exactly in with our understanding, indicating the atmospheric pressure adjusted to sea level. Okay, right. Can't clear that up anymore. I think we've got everything there, and again we're going to use it in whichever of the 3 units that we're going to use. Out of interest, I don't actually know what a millibar is. Maybe it's a disused method. Oh, I see. Millibar is it's millimeters mercury. I see, that is a millibar. Right, okay, makes sense. Okay, let's go and see what Soames has written for us before we move any further. As you can imagine, these were set at a time when Morse code was in common use, allowed for brevity, consistency of communication between radio stations for ordinary codes. Yep, so what he's saying there is that the reason they were set out in this 3-digit way was because of Morse code. Many of the error codes have fallen out of use due to improved electronic and digital telemetry systems. So see here for a comprehensive list of the old error Q codes. We've just looked at that. Some believe that QNH or QFE actually stands for query nautical height or query field elevation. This is not the case. However, these are useful mnemonics to aid the pilot to remember the difference between QNH and QFE. So yeah, that makes sense. So QNH refers to atmospheric pressure adjusted to mean sea level, and QFE the atmospheric pressure at an airfield. The difference between the two being the result of altitude and local air pressures. All of that makes exact sense and tallies exactly with what we've been saying in the Q code definitions. Now, there's further reading if you guys want to go into it further. Most of this is not really going to relate to our use of QNH in QFE in DCS, but there are more real-world uses. Aviation Q code to the official ICAO. What else have we got? When to use QFE and QNH in the Sky Library. Settings and procedures. Also reference to accidents, which is kind of what this is all about, reducing accidents. Result from changing between QFE and QNH. During IFR. I will link all of these links in the video so you can go and look at them in your own free time. Okay, so next we're going to jump into DCS and have a look at why it's important to us in the DCS world. Okay, we're in DCS world now, and we're going to start in the mission editor. So we've got our aircraft down here. We're starting on a relatively low island. If you look down at the bottom of the screen, you can see where this airfield here is 20 feet above sea level. Sea level is obviously altitude 0, and we're going to look at another airport down here, Al Ain International, and that's going to be 814 feet elevation above sea level. The next thing is looking that we can actually set the regional QNH, and QNH is always regional. So if we just picked a moment in time, let's say that moment is now, the QNH, which is the mean pressure at sea level here, which is, where are we, Persian Gulf, at sea level is going to be different to the sea level QNH at China, which is different to the QNH sea level in England. And the reason is the things that actually go to make up QNH, to make the air pressure, are very complicated. They factor such things as ambient temperature, as wind, as solar reflection. To be honest, it's stuff that I do, above my pay grade. It's stuff that I don't understand. But my point here is it's very complex in how nature sets up the QNH. So what we're going to say there is that it's regional. This region has a regional QNH. And next I want to show that we can change it, if I can remember how. We click environment there, and we can see we've got QNH here. Now, as standard, it's set at 29.92, and 29.92 is the international ISA standard. But like we said, nature controls the actual QNH. So I, in this little bar here, am representing nature, and I can set it to whatever I want. So why don't I set it to today's QNH at this time, this day, with this weather, is a regional at sea level pressure of 29.8 inches mercury. And this is also something I used to get a bit confused at. Now note the conditions here. I get to change the temperature at sea level. And I always used to think, well, I can change the temperature here, but why is it not changing the QNH here? Surely if the temperature goes up, we know if temperature goes up, ambient temperature goes up, pressure goes down. And in a super simple world, yes, I guess that would be right. There is a type of relationship between ambient temperature and QNH, but it's not full-blooded proportional relationship. And so the way DCS World works, it just keeps them completely separate. It allows you to change the temperature, anything you want. It will not affect the QNH. You can then go and change it to whatever QNH you want. And the reason is not, like I said, it's not just temperature that affects QNH. It's winds, it's solar gain, and all the other things that, to be honest, I just don't understand. Okay, so that's the QNH we're going with today. We're going to save that. And we're going to enter the DCS world. Stand by. Oh, another good point. I forgot to say that when we're talking about the DCS physics engine, i.e. how much lift you get in the plane, how much drag there is on the plane, how, all the different things in terms of physics, how the aeroplanes react and missiles react with their world. My understanding is that it's based on the temperature, the ambient temperature setting there. It is not based on the QNH. The QNH, as far as I understand, in DCS is purely specific to barometric altimeter settings. So I'm going to jump on at F18, and we've just chosen F18 because it's probably the most popular one out there that everyone just seems to want to drive. So first of all, let's look at our two altimeters. One is this one here. The first one is this one. This is our barometric altimeter. Like I said, it's just a pressure gauge. This one down here is our radio or radar altimeter. So this one works by measuring the pressure, and this one works by shooting radio waves down at the ground, letting them reflect up, measuring the time it took to go down and up, and then giving us a distance that way. Now, the way these two are used are completely different. They give us different things. This here gives us the distance between the bottom of our aircraft and the ground. This here does not give us that. I know at first thoughts you think it should, but it's not. This is telling us an effective distance of between where we are at the moment and wherever we've set our 0 point, which we'll go through in a bit. So if we flew over a mountain, for instance, this one would change because the distance between us and the ground would be changing. This one would not change because the distance between us and the 0 that we set will not change if we go over undulating terrain. And so generally speaking, I've talked to a military pilot and a civilian pilot about this. Generally speaking, navigation is going to be done by using this guy here. So landing, generally, taking off, getting to altitude, general flying. This one is going to be used generally for ground evasion. So going over hills, stuff like that, avoiding hitting the ground. So they will be used very differently, generally speaking. Now also note that the barometric altimeter is also displayed up here on the HUD. And there's a big misunderstanding that this guy here is some kind of magically computed altitude. And it's not. It's literally just reading what this says here. So you can see that that is reading 130 feet at the moment on the gauge. And that says 130 feet. So why is it saying 130 feet if in fact we are actually what? So this is God mode. If you look at the top left, you can say we're actually at, well, as near as makes no difference, let's say 20 feet above sea level. And that's because we haven't set our barometric pressure up. We haven't zeroed it to anything. And it's really important to understand, if it's not zero to anything, it means absolutely nothing. You have to zero your barometric altimeter for it to actually mean anything. Now, just as standard out of the box, this aircraft will always be centered or set to 29.92 inches of mercury. As the QNH of the mission is different, if we press left Alt and B, we can see this mission, as we've set, is actually 29.80 at sea level. So, if we wanted to change this to 29.80, what we're doing is setting our barometric altimeter to the QNH. We've zeroed it to sea level, and you can see it's now saying that we are 20 feet or so above sea level, and we can see here that we are indeed 20 feet above sea level. Now, another thing we could do is to zero our altimeter to this airfield here. Well, if we wanted to do that, we don't know the pressure of this airfield, and we could find it out, but just for the time being we don't know. What we could do is to turn it until the needle reads 0. That is zeroing your altimeter without knowing the actual pressure setting. So we've zeroed it there. You can see it now reads 0 here, and out of interest you can also read your pressure setting there when you're adjusting it. So my main point that I'm trying to tell you there is that this, at least set in barometric mode, I know you can change it to radar down here. Is it that one there? That one there. As it's standard barometric, it doesn't really mean anything. All it means is its relationship in terms of air pressure differential to the air pressure that you've zeroed in here. So I hope I've helped that understanding. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is, before we take off from this airfield, is we're going to zero it, and that's exactly what we've just done. So it now reads 0 at this airfield. And what we're going to do is we're going to take off, we're going to ferry a couple of 100 miles down to that other base that we saw that was at a different altitude above sea level, and then see what difference we get there. So I'm going to take off and report back when I'm near that other airfield. Welcome back. So we've completed our journey. The airfield is in front of us, and if we just go back to God mode, we can see that the airfield is at, where is it? 814 feet above sea level, ASL. And if we look at our barometric altimeter, then remember that we've still got it set up so that it was zeroed to the other airfield that was 20 feet above sea level, 29.775 inches mercury. So the first thing to see is what happens now if we go and try and land on this airfield with the pressure setting zeroed to the previous airfield. I think you already know what's going to happen, but we'll go and look anyway, and then we'll talk about the implications of it. So we'll look at the heads-up display version of it here, make sure we're in barometric, and we are. I'm just going to make a really crappy effort to land here, but you'll get the idea. Slow down a bit. You're up, so I'm at 1600 feet, 1400 feet, 1200 feet. The radio altimeter is going off, and that's our first sign that something's wrong, because our radio altimeter, we set the warning at 450 feet. It should only go off when we reach 450 feet, but our altimeter, barometric altimeter, is saying we're at 1000, so it must be okay. So let's keep going. 950 feet, 850 feet, and smash! We've crashed into the ground at 830 feet, or a little bit lower there. So, because we have not re-referenced our altitude to the QFE, to the elevation of interest, which is going to be this runway here, therefore it's telling us that we're at 800 feet, when in fact, of course, we're only at about, well, what does our radar altimeter say? Our radar altimeter says we're at 20 feet, which of course is what we're at. Now, this isn't so bad if you did this in VFR conditions. That means flying where you can see perfectly fine like this, because in these conditions, at DCS at least, to be honest, you wouldn't bother looking at your altimeter. You would just do it all by looking at your aircraft in relation to the runway. And hence, in VFR conditions, in DCS world, you probably wouldn't bother. And if you see with all of our pilots, none of us bother, because what's the point? We can judge easily our altitude in relation to runway by our eyes. Now, in real life, it's good practice if you do change re-zero this, set this to the QFE, which is going to be the altitude of the runway that you're landing at in VFR conditions. I've talked to a lot of real pilots. Sometimes you just don't do it. But it's very important if you were in IFR conditions. That means when you can't see, if it's foggy or if it's cloudy, when you are completely relying on your altimeter here, you must set the QFE, i.e. you must zero your altimeter to the runway in that case, otherwise you will crash. And you can see that, as if I had no eyes here, if this was complete whiteout in fog, I would have crashed in the ground, because I would have thought we were actually at 800 feet when we were actually at 20 feet. So that's what this is all about. That's what this QNH and this QFE altitude safety is all about. Okay, so we'll unpause now, we'll do a emergency go around, and then we'll do this properly. So, whoop, up we go. So next we're going to set our altitude here, our altimeter, sorry, to the QFE. That is the point of interest, which is this airbase here. There are two ways that we can do that, or find out the QFE. That is, we can use it on an online calculator, or we can ask the traffic control here, the ATC, what the QFE for this runway is. Now, there's some dispute about this. In real life, it's disputed that you cannot use a calculator to work out the real life QFE, mainly for the reasons like I was saying earlier. In real life, it's much more complicated than it is in DCS. So in real life, it's argued that the only way to do this is to talk to the tower to get the actual QFE of their airfield. We're not going to go into any further than that because we're getting a bit too far away from the original video. But for DCS at least, you can go and use an online calculator. In fact, why don't I go and do it now? So if I type in our QNH, which is the pressure at sea level of 29.80, I think we set it to, didn't we? And if I find the feet above ASL of our runway, which is 814 feet, compute, it's saying that we should set our QFE or altimeter to 28.933 inches mercury. Now let's go and confirm that by talking to the tower and check that he agrees with that and gives us the same or a very similar figure. So pause, contact, 5, 1.
Springfield 1-1, inbound. Springfield 1-1. Fly heading 007, port 11, QFE 28.94, runway
let me just write that down. 28.94, and in our calculator we got 28.9337. So virtually the same figure. So that shows that in DCS you can do it with an online calculator. In the real life, it's ill-advised. Okay, so let's just set up our altimeter. 28.94, I think he said, didn't he? 94. Yeah, 2894 inches mercury. So we've now zeroed our altimeter to our QFE, which is this runway here, wherever it's gone. Let's see if it works. So imagine we were coming down in IFR conditions now. Imagine we couldn't actually see the runway. We would be completely reliant on our altimeter there. Yes, 100 feet. 800 feet. The gear out? I think they are, aren't they? Flaps down, Roger. Let's get on our alpha error bracket. 400 feet. $200 feet. $100 feet. 80 feet. And a feather now because I'm pretending that I'm not in an F-18. 50 feet, 20, 40 feet, and you can see that we're at 40 feet here, so the pressure that he gave us was slightly wrong. He rounded it up. It's actually more likely that our pressure that I got off my online calculator was actually better. I'm just going to try plugging it in, just out of interest, see if it is. Stop rolling. Whee! Yep. That's how you park in style. So if I go to 3, something like that, 28925, something like that would have been a bit more perfect, but there's always a bit of error in the system. Right, so we've explained what QNH is, why it's useful. We've explained what QFE is, why it's useful. The only thing I want to tag along that is that it's not just for landing. Some aircraft use it for targeting as well. An example of that would be the Viggen uses air pressure, uses QFE for its elevation in terms of targeting. I don't know why it does that. Most other aircraft don't. I believe most other aircraft like this will use purely INS, inertial navigation system, in terms of elevation, or at least that's how I understand it. I mean, I may be wrong in that, but in the Viggen, it's the only aircraft I know of where you set your altimeter here to the target that you want to bomb in terms of a QFE, and it will guide its weapons control system like its bombs, like its rockets. And one other tiny thing I should mention, I believe this is civilian and military, is that if you get above a certain level, known as the transition level, then all aircraft will be kind of unified in that you set your altimeter, instead of to the QNH or maybe to a QFE, you set it to a standardized pressure for all the reasons of uniformity. Okay, that's all I've got to say on that. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that was useful. Took me quite a long while to figure it out, and I'll see you later.